Now, if I want to add prompt engineering in a structured way, so with the structure here, you can see there is role, context, task, constraint, and format. The most important ones, I'm telling you this because I've done it thousands of times, well, tens of thousands of times, and even trained thousands of professionals. The idea is that the role is interesting, but it's not the most important thing. What is generally the most interesting is the context, the task, and the format. Why? Because we always start, whether we want to or not, with a task. The objective, for example, could be, could you analyze these two contracts for me and create a table with the pros and cons, according to about 20 criteria, which are as follows. Here, I've included a task and a format. But it's the task that's most important, because if there's no objective, what does the AI generate? What does it do? It doesn't really serve much purpose. The context, on the other hand, is what supports the mission. So as soon as I tell you this, for example, if I say to it, can you analyze these two contracts for me according to the following criteria? Let's say I give it the criteria. Now, the context is going to be important. I really like to introduce the context like this by saying, knowing that. Why? Because otherwise, artificial intelligence will just make a comparison. Sure, it might be interesting, but it won't be relevant to the task at hand. So, for example, if I'm comparing two contracts, let's say for a purchase, a warehouse for my e-commerce business, I'll be able to tell it, knowing that it's for acquiring a warehouse to increase our productivity and deliveries, to make deliveries for my company easier. Knowing that by giving it this information, actually, I'm not just giving it a task in a vacuum. I'm not just saying, can you make a comparison for me? I'm really telling it why it's important. And it's very, very important to specify that. And to give a bit of context to this artificial intelligence. Because otherwise, it more or less does whatever, or it does what I call the appearance of quality. Something that looks good, that might be useful for another professional, but that won't be useful for you. And that's why context is so important. The format is super useful, so it allows you to define the type of deliverable. So, for example, if I tell it, knowing that I want a report, comma, it also allows you to define the structure with bullet lists, as well as tables. So here, I'm really giving you the entire format, as well as the length. Be concise with the bullet lists, but be extremely thorough and detailed with the tables. You can say exhaustive or brief. You can say either long or concise. The goal, once again, of prompt engineering is not to make using AI more complicated, it's just to know what you can tell it and then to keep the level of complexity that you're most comfortable with. So here I'm going to ask for a table, but also the style. So, for example, I can tell it I want headings as well as bold for the important elements, italics, especially for statistics and numbers. Here you can already see that we can really influence the artificial intelligence. And finally, now this is the more constraint side, constraint, if you will. The idea is, personally, I usually put constraints in the format section, but here I've separated them for you because I thought it might be a bit clearer. After that, you can give it constraints by telling it, I don't want you to do any analysis. Yourself, I just want you to report the information. So here I'm giving it a constraint on what it can do. All your sources must come from 2025 and 2026. And finally, the last constraint, which is often the length constraint. Your report must not exceed 8,000 characters. Here, I'm just going to specify it for. Make sure to do all of this using fictional data and on a fictional topic. It's just for a test. That way we can still give it a try. And you'll see that this artificial intelligence will add titles and subtitles. We can see the subtitles. Concise bullet points. Tables. Extremely long and detailed, just as I asked. A lot of numbers. You can see that all the numbers are in italics. The important elements are in bold. I'm just checking a bit. There's bold on the important elements, and my report doesn't seem too long to me. I asked it, could you tell me the number of characters in this report? And now I'm going to get exactly what I want. So these are really the three most important elements, really. So here it made me something with 3,000 characters. I could ask, can you redo it so that it's really closer to 8,000 characters? In general, this information about the 8,000 characters? I use it to try to push it to its limits, to make it actually increase its length. Quite simply, if I hadn't asked for 8,000 characters, it probably would have made me something much shorter. In any case, the goal is to see that the context, so by telling it, knowing that it's related to that, Knowing that if you're writing emails, for example, knowing that Mr. Dubaro always wants to be, you see, that he doesn't like technical jargon, that he needs to have key information and facts, well, the key information as well as the facts. You see, you can really provide a lot of context. What I generally like to say is that if an intern who just joined the company, who is super talented but doesn't know the company's context, can't do it, or is missing information, that means artificial intelligence will need more context. So it's very important. The task, which is really vital, we usually always start with the task. So it's task, context, or context and task, whichever you prefer. And finally, the format. These are the three most important elements. I'll quickly tell you about the others. The role, for example, is going to be very useful when you're in a field that's quite varied, and you notice that artificial intelligence tends not to understand you. Here, for example, let's say the AI gave me a little comparison and all that. What could have been useful is if I were an accountant. So, an accountant dealing with taxes, optimization, management support, and assisting business owners. In the end, I could have set myself as an accountant or taken on the role of an accountant, because otherwise it would have given me something else. Maybe too close to the numbers. He would have been too much of an accountant who does accounting production, so someone who analyzes numbers, does financial analysis, whereas the certified public accountant is really focused on the company strategy. So the role is very important. Specifically, when AI you feel like it doesn't understand you or it hasn't quite grasped the angle you want it to take, the perspective from which you want it to respond. If you feel that the AI isn't really on topic or isn't really familiar with your industry, the role can also be useful to provide a bit more context by saying something like, knowing that you are a data analyst in everything related to business acquisition, specifically in leverage buyouts. For example, that could be an idea. That way I specify the job. And at the same time, the industry. So you can see that the role and the context are actually very, very close. Personally, I consider context to be the most important because you can actually include quite a lot of things in the context. The role is very important when you notice that the AI is having trouble understanding you. So, once again, those were the most important elements. You'll see that in the rest of the course, we're really going to dive into the details, down to the smallest specifics. But in any case, if you've already understood these elements, if you have a general idea of what artificial intelligence can do, for example, in terms of formatting, you now know it can create tables, use bold, add headings, make bulleted lists, manage length, and highlight important elements in bold. If you understand that, that's already 50% of the battle. The rest is just making it part of your routine. So I'll leave you with that. And then we'll get down to the serious stuff.